It's not... The trees don't go all the way down. I put my hand through the bark and it's drywall. It smells like a hospital. There's a hallway behind the pine trees. There's a fluorescent light on in the hallway, and there's a clipboard on the floor, and I can see my name on it, and I can see numbers. I think those are my numbers. I think that's my heart. Now, you settle in. Pull that blanket up a little higher. Let me tell you about a man named Leo and a campsite he found on a map that was never supposed to be shared with anybody. And I want you to understand, before we get into any of it, that Leo was not a foolish man. He was not the kind of man who wandered off trails without knowing where he was going. He was not the kind of man who ignored warnings printed in bold red letters at the top of a document. He was, however, the kind of man who convinced himself that the warnings were for other people. Most of us are. There are rules to the Appalachian woods. Not the kind you'll find printed on a laminated card at the ranger station, though those exist too. About bear canisters and fire rings and not feeding the wildlife. Those are sensible rules. I'm talking about the other kind. The kind passed between people who've spent real time out in those hills. The kind you learn by listening. The first rule is that the woods have a sound. And if that sound ever stops, if the crickets go quiet, if the frogs stop their calling, if even the wind seems to hold its breath, you stop too. You don't move. You wait. Because something made everything else go quiet. And you want to know what that something is before you go stumbling toward it. The second rule is about birds. Birds in the Appalachians are a kind of living compass. Where birds fly, air moves. Where air moves, the land breathes. A hollow without birds flying over it is a hollow that nature has quietly decided to leave alone. Old-timers call it a dead ceiling. You camp under a dead ceiling long enough, they say, and you start to feel like something is pressing down on you from above. Like the sky is lower than it ought to be. The third rule, and this one matters for what happened to Leo, is about maps. A map of the Monongahela National Forest that looks right but feels wrong is more dangerous than no map at all. The forest is old enough and deep enough that cartographers have made mistakes, and some of those mistakes have been standing in ink for 100 years. If a trail on a map doesn't appear on 3 separate maps, some old men will tell you, don't walk it. If a campsite appears on only one map, one single document, and there's no other record of it anywhere, you leave it alone. Leo knew all three of these rules. He'd been camping in the Monongahela since he was 11 years old, following his uncle through hollows that didn't have names yet, sleeping under skies so clear and black and heavy with stars that they felt almost architectural. He knew the smell of rain on quartzite. He knew the sound a creek makes when it's running over shale versus limestone. He was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of person who should have known better. And still, the map came to him through a forum, one of those old internet places, the kind with a dark background and white text, and a community that had been quietly talking to itself since the early 2000s. A thread titled Hidden Gems, Mon Forest, Off-Grid Sites, No Permit Required. Most of the thread was ordinary enough: fire roads and dispersed camping areas, places where the cell service was good enough to download a podcast before you lost signal entirely. But about 40 posts down, someone with a username that was just a string of numbers had posted a scan of a document. Government letterhead. United States Forest Service, it said at the top. And then below that, in a font that looked slightly different from the rest of the document, like it had been added later by a different printer: Recreational Use Supplement, Classified Site Registry, Appendix D. Most of the document was blacked out, thick black bars across every line of text, the kind of redaction you see on FOIA documents, the kind that suggests someone went through with a very wide marker and a very thorough hand. But in the middle of the page, one section had been left visible. Whether by accident or by design, Leo couldn't say. It showed a topographic area, a clearing, coordinates printed in small type. And in the center of the clearing, rendered as a small gray square on the map, a notation that read, Concrete Platform, 20 feet by 20 feet, designated Rest Area. See Appendix F. Appendix F was entirely blacked out. At the very top of the document, in red ink, the word Classified had been stamped at an angle, the way those stamps always seem to land, like the person doing the stamping was in a mild hurry. Leo looked at that stamp for a long time, long enough that you'd think he was reconsidering. But what he was actually doing, if you'd asked him, was convincing himself it was old, that the classification was historical, that whatever government project had been associated with that clearing had been shut down decades ago, and the only thing left was a concrete slab that some bored federal employee had, in a moment of bureaucratic optimism, labeled a rest area. He wrote down the coordinates in a small orange notebook. He closed his laptop. He started packing his gear. He drove up on a Thursday, the kind of late September Thursday that the Appalachians do better than anywhere else on earth. The air cool and carrying that particular smell of dried leaves and creek water and something faintly mineral underneath, like the mountains themselves are exhaling. The road into the forest off Route 39 was one he'd taken before, though only as far as the main trailhead. Past that point, he was on a fire road, crushed gravel and two-track, the kind of road that exists to give Forest Service trucks access to places tourists aren't supposed to go. His headlights swept across the birch trees at the road's edge. They stood close together, white-barked and still, and in the moving light they looked briefly like people standing at attention. He drove slowly, not because the road required it, though it did, but because the Appalachians at dusk have a quality of compression, like the world is quietly folding inward. And moving too fast through that feeling has always seemed to Leo like an act of disrespect. The coordinates took him off the fire road entirely, onto something that wasn't quite a path and wasn't quite nothing. Compressed undergrowth, a kind of suggestion of passage. He parked where the suggestion ended and walked the last quarter mile with his pack and his headlamp. The clearing arrived suddenly, the way clearings in dense forest always do. One moment you're in the trees and then you're simply not, and the sky opens up above you and feels enormous and close at the same time. The moon was 3/4 full. It was enough light to see the concrete slab at the center of the clearing, gray and smooth and absolutely, perfectly square, 20 feet by 20 feet. He paced it out, exactly right. He stood at the edge of it for a moment and looked up. No birds. Not the absence of birds that happens when it's late and the diurnal species have roosted. A different kind of absence. Structural almost. Like the air above the clearing had a ceiling to it, invisible and definitive, and the birds knew it was there and flew around it the way water flows around a stone. He noticed this. He filed it under interesting rather than alarming and set up his tent on the concrete slab because the ground around it was soft and uneven with roots, and the slab was flat and smooth and almost comfortable in its industrial plainness. He ate his dinner at the edge of the clearing, instant noodles from a titanium pot. The tree line was maybe 40 feet from the slab in every direction, and in the moonlight the pines at the edge looked particularly dark, particularly dense, the kind of darkness that has depth to it. He watched them while he ate, the way you watch a tree line when you're alone in the woods. Not because you expect to see anything, but because it's good practice to know what the static looks like before something changes it. The crickets were loud, rhythmically loud, almost metronomically loud, he thought. and then decided that was just because he'd been spending too much time in cities where biological things had to compete with mechanical ones, and you started hearing rhythm in everything. He slept at 10:30. The concrete was hotter than he'd expected through the tent floor, and the sleeping pad helped only somewhat. But he was tired from the drive and the walk and the particular good exhaustion that comes from a night in air that actually has oxygen in it, and he was asleep within minutes. He did not dream, or if he did, he didn't remember. What he remembered was waking up. It was 2 a.m. by his watch. He knew the time before he looked at it. Something had changed in the quality of the dark, in the texture of the silence, and his body had registered the change before his mind caught up. He lay still for a moment, the way you do when you're not sure what woke you, listening. And then he understood. The crickets had stopped. Not tapered off, not slowly gone quiet the way insects do as the temperature drops. Stopped. One moment they were there, rhythmic and atmospheric and constant. And the next moment, there was nothing. A silence so complete it had a pressure to it, like the inside of a sealed room. He unzipped his tent slowly. The clearing looked the same in the moonlight. The concrete slab, the tree line 40 feet in every direction, the sky above with its 3/4 moon. But something was wrong with the air. He could smell it before he could name it. Not the green, damp, faintly sweet smell of a September forest at night. Something else. Something sterile. Something that reminded him, in a way that didn't make any sense, of the inside of a dentist's office. That ozone and antiseptic smell. That smell of recycled air. He stood up on the slab and looked at the tree line. The trees were perfectly still. Not the stillness of a windless night, which has a quality of rest to it, a sense of held breath that will eventually release. This was a different stillness. Absolute. Unanimous. Every branch, every needle, every piece of loose bark on every trunk. Motionless in a way that felt less like calm and more like pause. Like someone had pressed a button. He walked toward the tree line slowly. He was not a man who scared easily, but he was a man who listened to his body, and his body was doing something quiet and insistent that he recognized as fear without panic, the low, humming kind that lives in the stomach and makes your hands feel very far away. He reached out and touched the nearest pine. The bark was wrong. It looked right. It had the texture of bark, the graying brown of mature pine, the faint resinous smell that pines carry. But it was rigid in a way that wood isn't. Wood has give to it, a subtle biological yielding. This had none. It was like touching a plaster cast of a tree, like touching the idea of a tree rather than a tree itself. He pressed harder. His fingers went through the surface, not through the way your fingers go through rot or soft wood, through the way your fingers go through drywall. He pulled his hand back, looked at the white powder on his fingertips, fine, chalky, the color of a clean wall. He pushed the bark panel aside. It swung inward on a hinge he hadn't seen. Behind it was a hallway. Fluorescent lights, one of them flickering slightly, casting that particular institutional light that makes everything look like evidence. Linoleum floor, pale gray. Walls painted the color of nothing, the color that government buildings use when they want you to stop looking at the walls. The hallway went left and right, and there was no visible end in either direction. On the floor, just inside the opening, there was a clipboard. He reached in and picked it up. His hands were shaking now, the fine motor kind of trembling that happens when your nervous system has decided it's had enough of pretending nothing is wrong. He held the clipboard under the flickering light. It was a data log, columns of numbers time-stamped. The header read, Project Greenbriar, Participant Monitoring, Perceptual Immersion Study, Phase 3. Below that, the subject identification number. And below that, printed in standard government font, so ordinary it was almost insulting. Subject, Leo M. Caraway. Age, 34. Baseline heart rate, 62 beats per minute. And then the log. Every hour of the night recorded. His heart rate at 10:47 p.m. when he'd been eating his noodles, 68 beats per minute. His heart rate at 11:03 p.m. when he'd been lying in his tent trying to sleep, 59 beats per minute. His resting rate at 12:30 a.m., deep in sleep, 54 beats per minute. And at the bottom of the log, the most recent entry, time-stamped 2:04 a.m., written not in print, but in handwriting, the same pen that had presumably just set this clipboard on the floor moments before he found it. 2:04 a.m. Subject has breached the perimeter. Heart rate, 119 beats per minute. Recommended action. The recommended action was blacked out. A thick bar of ink, applied by someone who had apparently prepared for this possibility. Leo stood in the doorway between the hallway and the clearing, between the fluorescent light and the moonlight, and he held the clipboard with both hands. The flickering light made his shadow jump on the linoleum. Behind him, the clearing looked exactly as it had looked all evening. The concrete slab, the moon, The trees standing in their silent circle. The trees that were not trees. He thought about the map, the red classified stamp at its angle, Appendix F, blacked out entirely. He thought about the no birds and the metronomic crickets and the smell of recycled air that he'd noticed and filed away under interesting. He thought about how long he'd been asleep, how long the experiment had been running before tonight, whether tonight was the only night, or whether the coordinates had been waiting in that forum thread for a specific kind of person to find them. The kind of person who would convince himself the warning was for other people. He set the clipboard back down on the linoleum floor, very carefully, and stepped back into the clearing and let the bark panel swing shut behind him. The hallway disappeared. The tree was a tree again. He went back to his tent. He got inside. He zipped it closed. He did not sleep. At dawn, the birds came back as if they'd never left, calling from the tree line in ordinary, cheerful, biological voices. And the air smelled like pine and creek water and September. And his watch said 6:17 a.m., and somewhere in the forest a woodpecker was going about its business against a dead tree. And everything was exactly as it should be. His heart rate was 119 beats per minute. It stayed that way for a very long time. Sleep well now. Don't worry about the trees.